Good morning, and I always get it wrong. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Crazy Talk with me, your host, Lee Thomas. That's me. Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show where I interview all sorts of people who are experts in mental health, people with lived experience, people with degrees behind their name, and people who I have the good luck to meet at conferences. And just pals and Facebook friends and all sorts of people of mine who are just awesome and doing really, really, really cool things in mental health. So today we're going to be interviewing Chelsey Hicks. Hi, Chelsey, joining us all the way from beautiful St. John's, Newfoundland. Chelsey is someone who sits on kind of both sides of the table, both as a service provider and as someone who avails herself of services. She's also the and the executive director of Dance Through It, which is really, really cool. So hi, Chelsey. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
So Chelsey, just kind of to kick us off, get us started, do you want to tell us a bit about what Dance Through It is and why you got involved with it?
Yeah. So I guess to make a very long story short, I found myself in a place where I was availing of lots of services. I was very sick, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have access to dancing tuition. So I started volunteering at a local community center, teaching dancing. But by the second week, I had students showing up early, and they were insisting on staying late. And it wasn't because of the dancing. I think it was, I know it was because of the connection to an outside source outside of their community. So from there, I kind of grew, and it went from, a once a week volunteer commitment to we're now a nonprofit organization with a national reach. I travel, I do keynotes, I do wellness workshops alongside of the curriculum aspect as well.
Oh, that's really exciting. And that's just, it's one of those things where, and maybe you can speak more to this, because I think a lot of the time when people think of mental health organizations, they think of, very, very clinical, very medical, very, you come in, you get your medications, you leave, or you come in and you do your DBT and then you leave and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So having kind of a dance aspect as a mental health aspect is, I think, something that not a lot of people would instinctively think of in their first go.
And it's a great point, because that's, I guess, why Dance Through It has taken off the way that it has, is it's something that's very grassroots. I saw a major gap within, systems of care, specifically speaking to, young women growing up in housing. I saw there was a big gap there. We see these toxic cycles exist within society around, poverty, institutionalization, so on and so forth, without really investing in breaking those cycles. The act of insanity, for a lack of a better word, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So I think, going in and doing something different, doing something that comes from a place of like, this worked for me, and that's why I'm here. I sit on one side of the table and I sit on the other too.
Yeah. Which probably gives you a pretty unique perspective, because I think a lot of the times, especially with the medical model that we kind of work in, you're not expected to sit on both sides of the table. Like, not you specifically, but people in general are not expected to be able to sit on both sides of the table, right? You are either one or the other.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of where, our work as advocates come in, is that stigma. I myself, I live with post-traumatic stress disorder and generalized anxiety. And I think those labels can be very damaging, or they can be very liberating. And I guess that kind of depends on the services that you avail of, because sometimes, organizations are with the intentions of helping you, due to the nature of the way that we build our society around helping vulnerable populations, it puts you in a box. Like, oh, you are this now. You avail of this. You are this type of vulnerable. And I think a lot of the healing that comes from creating Dance Through It for me was recognizing that I can be both. I can be vulnerable and I can be very strong. It's not linear in that way.
Yeah. And I think that's it's a fine line for a lot of people to walk, right? That whole idea of labels and boxes, right? Because sometimes people find those labels and those boxes very liberating and very comforting and very it helps them find community and helps them learn more about themselves and all that kind of stuff. But on the other side, sometimes people find those labels in those boxes so restrictive because it says this is who you are, and because of that, this is what you can do, and this is, you know, and it sets all of these limitations for people, which is, it's wild how like that same act of, you know, kind of labeling, I guess, can have such a different impact based on, you know, the way the labeling is done and the way it goes for the person as well.
And I guess too, like what it holds in your life, right? One of the things I'm also recognizing now is understanding that as an advocate, that in itself is a privilege. You know, I'm very privileged to have this access to all sorts of unique types of education that I've received over the years to understand through emotional intelligence when I'm availing of a service, if it's doing me right, you know, because that's not always the case. And just having that power in my voice to understand, like, you know, I need to advocate for myself here. You know, this isn't just, I always do it, and I always do it with the intention of understanding that there are people out there who, from no fault of their own, don't understand the system, and they don't understand that, like, you deserve better. Yeah, that's kind of been the latest.
Yeah. And that can be like really heartbreaking to realize that, because I mean, I don't know exactly how it works in Newfoundland, but I know in New Brunswick, we're really struggling with wait times. And that, like, you know, by the time you finally get up all the courage that it takes to ask for help, and you ask someone for help, and then you get put on a wait list for, depending where you live in the province, you know, like weeks, months, years. Yeah, exactly. Depending what kind of service you're trying to access and where you're trying to access it. And so I found that really difficult for myself. And I feel like I'm a person very similar to you who is able to advocate for myself and able to be familiar enough with the system to know how it should be working for me. And even I have a hard time being like, hey, this is unjust. And you know what? Hey, I deserve better than this. And so for people who might not have that experience with the system, or might not be in a position of, like, you know, wellness where they're able to advocate for themselves, it's a very discouraging process.
For sure. And I think that's why, you know, I'll always say dream big, you know, dream huge. And I think for me, that big, lifelong, you know, aspiration is system reform. So essentially that means, like, understanding these systems are very old, and it's time to kind of rewire the way that we've been working them. Specifically with Dance Through It, a lot of my work there is around social emotional learning. So understanding that we all don't come from the same backgrounds of understanding these essential things that we need to thrive, you know, whether that be anger management, positive coping, healthy relationship skills, all of these things that naturally we assume we all have, which is not really the case.
Yeah.
So
in, like, if we are dreaming big, and I just want to follow this big dream and see how it plays out. So if we are dreaming big and, you know, we're investing in social and emotional learning, like, what does that look like in terms of practical applications? Like, is this something that you want to see rolled out in schools, or how would that, in your big perfect world where you get to make everything the right way?
I can just wave my wand.
Yes, exactly. Like, what would that look like?
I think, yeah, definitely from K to 12, you know. When I first learned about social emotional learning was actually at the Atlantic Symposium for Child and Youth Mental Health, their first one 3 years ago. And they had a doctor come in and present on social emotional learning. I was 19 at the time. I had just gotten out of a treatment center where I had to go and learn about how to live with PTSD. And I was just in this state of recognizing that, like, wow, like, I invested in my recovery and now people are investing in me. And then to sit in that lecture hall, my first lecture, and to listen to a doctor talk about social emotional learning. And I just remember my brain was like, oh my God, how does everybody not know about this? Because in so many countries across the world, they're teaching social emotional learning as a curriculum from K to 12. And then when you go and you look at their statistics around their like incarceration rates and, you know, rehospitalizations and so on and so forth, naturally, they're staggering in terms of how low they are, right? And we're looking right now, I would say mental health in Canada right now is definitely an epidemic. We're reactive instead of responsive. So we react in terms of, the analogy of, oh, there's a fire. We have to put the fire out now, rather than realizing like, there's a really hot heater that's next to some plastic. We should respond and probably separate the two. So yeah, I guess in a big world, dreaming big, social emotional learning is something that goes from K to 12, because it's we have to practice, we have to learn. And ultimately, if it affects all areas of our life.
Yeah, definitely. And I think schools are such a good opportunity for us to kind of get involved with mental health stuff, because you have all of these youth in these very formative ages. And what I always talk about when I do my presentations, because like I also like do keynote presentations, to schools and stuff. And one of the things that I often say is, I learned how to do a layup. I learned how to do a layup in grade 7. I have vivid memories of doing a layup in grade 7.
Right.
And like I'm 5 foot nothing. Like I'm never gonna be in the NBA. I've really come to terms with not being in the NBA. Yeah. And from grade 7 through to grade 10, when I was allowed to drop out of gym class, I had to do layups every single year, and I learned how to do these layups. But so I could probably still do a layup if gun to my head, I could probably still do it. But I never learned, how to ask for help, even though there was a 1 in 5 chance that I would need to, right? I never learned anything about mental health. I never learned and those social emotional learning pieces. I know it's about more than just mental health and mental illness, but there are all of these opportunities to have these huge influences on our youth. And, sometimes we're not taking advantage of all of those opportunities, I guess.
Well, teachers are the 3rd biggest working force in Canada. What if every teacher had mental health first aid training? The stats show that in terms of disclosures, if a child is going to disclose something, they're seeing their teacher 5 days a week. It's little things like that where if we were to really rewire and really kind of analyze how we can change that reactive versus responsive nature, schools seem to be the easiest venue and the smartest, really.
Yeah. And I love that, like the fire analogy. It reminds me of one where, and it might have been at the ASI conference as well, but I'm not super certain. But we were talking about specifically post-secondary mental health, but I think it applies very well to, secondary and middle school mental health as well. But this idea that, if all the frogs in a pond are sick, you don't look at the frogs and go, what's wrong with this frog? How do we help this frog? You look at the pond and you go, what is happening in this pond that is making so many frogs sick?
Absolutely.
But that's a much more difficult thing than just treating individual frogs, right? like jumping from fire to fire, as much as it's absolutely necessary. I think, I feel like fires will always be there to some extent, but we can turn and look and say, okay, how do we prevent some of these fires? How do we make fireproof people? How do we remove the source of this fire instead of let's just keep running from fire to fire?
And I think with that is understanding that that's a lot of work, Yes. And I think that's why as of late I've become I always aspire to be someone who works in the front lines. I definitely want to pay my dues there and do that type of work. But I think in dreaming big and in talking long term, I would love to work in policy, and I'd love to work because ultimately the textbooks and the black and white paper, that's what really makes the change, right? And that's what ultimately holds stigma, or it holds, those setbacks and those areas where we advocate for, because it comes from places of policy.
Yeah. And I think that's something that I struggle with too, this idea of, is it better to be the frontline worker who's working directly with people, or is it better to be this person who does policy and helps a great number of people, but never directly interacts with people one-on-one? And it's and I've never been able to reconcile those two in my head. I'm like, I want to do both. I want to do both.
Do both. Dream big. Wave your wand.
Wave my wand. Do what I want. I love it. I love it. Okay, so I want to take a little bit of a not necessarily a step back, but a step sideways a little bit, and talk about, you were talking a little bit earlier, before we went live, we were talking a little bit earlier about this whole idea of structural stigma and the structural stigma in policy, because you also mentioned, like, policy is where the stigma is held. So for people who don't kind of know that or aren't aware of that, can you give us a little more insight into kind of this whole idea of structural stigma?
Right. So I guess background story. When I was really young, I started availing of all sorts of scholarships, going around and just like a sponge, learning all sorts of things. And the word structural stigma kept coming up. And, people would talk about it. And to be frank, and from a very privileged perspective, it was never really something that I actually understood. I knew what stigma felt like. I had dealt with that and the heavy repercussions of that, but never to the heavy structural side of it. And what I'm learning now is structural stigma is ultimately when there are things within society in place that hold you back because you've availed of services, because you have a diagnosis, because of your family's history, things that ultimately are building blocks of who you are. But because of that, it means that you can't get this certain job, or you can't be friends with this certain person anymore, or so on and so forth. I know for me personally, I've come into some structural stigma, a service that I availed of years ago. I'm no longer a client there anymore, but I've realized now that there's a policy in place that for 7 years, they have to keep my file due to whether they need it, whether I get incarcerated or I die or whatever. So because I'm still on file for 7 years, I'm still treated to the policy of as if I was a client. So I only just recently found this out. And naturally, I'm using those advocacy skills to kind of say, like, this is not just, this is not fair to me, I'm working hard to live my independent, healthy, recovery, stable life. And yeah, I guess there are pillars in place to kind of say, because you availed of this service years ago, this means this, this, and this.
Yeah, which can feel really unfair and really frustrating for, I think, a lot of people. And I think that's something that when we talk about mental health, I don't think we talk about the frustration enough. Because to me, like, that's the word that I always come back to when I talk about mental health, is just this feeling of frustration. Because it's frustration with yourself, frustration with the system, frustration with, like, all of these different things. So I don't know, maybe if you find that, or maybe you totally don't agree, which is fair.
No, I definitely feel that frustration, but I find the anger is what fuels me. If I wasn't angry, I don't think I would be acting on it. But I am angry, because I do recognize, hey, this is not fair. Why can't I wave my magic wand and just, but no, yeah. The frustration is real. And I think the frustration comes from a place of emotional labor, which is what we were talking about before we went live as well. So the idea that, you invest in something, you put in work, you do your research, you make yourself vulnerable for the sake of, trying to make change within the community, and putting yourself out there like that's in my world, that's one form of emotional labor.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time people don't think of advocacy as being emotional labor, I guess, or really being labor. And I think often even organizations are like, well, you're an advocate because you care, and if you really care, you will do this for free. For free, because it's like, oh, you're just a person with lived experience, you'll just speak to us for free, it's fine. And I don't know, that's kind of been in my experience, is that's often
it's so real.
Yeah, I know, right? And it's like, because you care about this, like, if you really cared about this, you wouldn't do it for money. And you're like, I have rent to pay. Like,
and I've put work into this, and I think that idea of it's a good cause. You care, it is a good cause, and I do care. And I think that's why I also really value my service. But that's a great point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as someone who's like, trying to run a business while also trying to be a mental health advocate, like it's hard to reconcile those two worlds for me at a lot of the time because, it is a good cause and I do care, like you said, but because I care, I can't afford to not value myself, right? Which is, I mean, you can call it self-care, you can call it self-compassion, you can call it like, a necessity of capitalism, like whatever you want to call it.
A necessity of capitalism. There we go.
There we go. Getting to the root of it. Yeah, here we go. Okay. So again, we're going to take a little step sideways, not necessarily back or forth, but a little bit sideways. And I know that you are very involved and very aware of what's going on kind of in the mental health world in Newfoundland and in Canada. And I'm wondering, have you noticed any trends or any shifts that either you think are really, really great or maybe that you find not so great, like kind of changes in the landscape of mental health in Canada?
So I guess I'll give credit where credit is due. And a couple of years ago, there was a coalition for mental health that was kind of started through government agencies, actually, politicians, where people went around to communities and really listened and said, what can we do around mental health? What needs to change? And I'll have to shout out Jerry Rogers, this phenomenal NDP fierce woman who I think really kind of took the lead on it. And they listened, but not only did they listen, which I think is so valuable to really go to the community and really, sit down and take a lashing because people are, like you said, people are angry about this. But I'm noticing now that their call to action pieces, because there have been some new services that have been brought in and there are plans for more things to change. There was recently a new youth center that opened up. So as someone, as a consumer and as someone who also provides services, I think it's really refreshing to see that we're not so stagnant anymore. People, because that's one thing that I find very frustrating. Let's talk about stigma. Okay, let's talk about it. Then what? Because talking about it only does so much. We have to talk about it, but then we also have to talk about what we're going to do about it. So I you've seen here in Newfoundland lately is, our government does understand and recognize that, yep, our hospital is from the 1800s and we have to do something about it. So they're not ready to build a new hospital yet, from what I understand, but they are ready to realize that, okay, if we're not doing that, then that means we have to do this, 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 and this.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So very much a start.
And that's the thing. You have to give credit where credit is due. And I think as an advocate, I'm always so hard on these agencies and these structures and these policies for all the right reasons. But I also think when we make progress, acknowledge it, recognize hey, that was a good move there, folks.
Yeah.
Progress.
And I think that's it's partly, to keep, as much as we don't like to really admit that this is part of advocacy, but it's to keep, people happy. It's to, that's partly to be you did a really great thing and I'm going to congratulate you on that because I want you to still be on my team and be on the team of this mission. Giving out those ally cookies or whatever. But it's also partly for our own, our own wellness instead of being I'm always hitting my head against this brick wall. It's but every once in a while, something really good happens. And we really have to celebrate that. And we really have to focus on that because otherwise, that frustration will just get away from you.
It will eat you alive. But that's that mindset, right? If you want to focus on the negative, you'll find the negative everywhere that you go, right? But if you keep in mind, there are positive things out there happening, you'll find that too.
Yeah. It can be difficult to search for that sometimes, but definitely getting in the practice of it. I know Absolutely. That's something that I used to do in the past is I would keep a gratitude journal. And every once in a while when I notice myself getting really down, I still I fall back on that exercise. You know what I mean? It's oh, today was the worst day ever. And it's okay, well, what are 4 good things that happened today, Lee? And it's oh, well, now I have to think of them.
And sometimes it's the little things. I had chocolate chip waffles for breakfast. Awesome.
Yeah, and using those to hold on to, you know, what you need in that moment.
Yeah,
which
sure.
Again, sometimes easier said than done, but an important thing for people to practice. Mm-hmm. So I guess, oh my goodness, we are getting close to the end, which is wild. This half hour has absolutely flown by. So I'm going to ask you if you had one thing to say to someone out there who maybe is struggling with their mental health, or someone out there who is feeling frustrated with the system, if you had one kind of message to send to them, and I'm sorry, I'm totally putting you on the spot here, but like,
no.
Yeah, like what would that be?
Never underestimate the power of self. So the idea that, you know, self-care, self-awareness, self-discipline, you can't change others, but you can change how you respond to others. So sometimes I think the hardest lesson that I've ever had to learn was knowing that, you know, if I'm crying on the washroom floor at 4 a.m., I'm going to pick myself up. No one else is necessarily going to do that for me. And there's a lot of power in understanding that there is power within self.
Yeah. It's a power in like both in a terrifying way and in a really empowering way.
Yeah.
Really liberating way. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Chelsey. Yeah. Okay, so I'm sure everyone who's watching the show is like, oh my goodness, Chelsey is so amazing. I need to learn more about Dance Through It, and I need to reach out to Chelsey, and I need to tell her how awesome I think she is. So if people wanted to reach out to you and they want to tell you how awesome they think you are, what is a good way for them to do that?
I have a little Facebook page for Dance Through It. So it's dance, and then for like street creds, the through is THRU, it. So that's a little Facebook page I have. It's not very active right now, as I am recently a student.
Congratulations.
So that's been a journey. So you can find me there or on my Twitter at Chelsey Hicks.
Okay, fabulous. Well, Chelsey, just thank you so much for being on the show, because I know we tried to do this like a couple weeks ago and we had all sorts of technical difficulties. So I'm really glad that we got you on the show, and thank you so much for, you know, the work that you do and for your advocacy work and for everything with Dance Through It. You know, the world is a much better place for having you in it. So thank you so much for that.
Oh. Thank you. And I guess thank you for holding spaces where talking about these complicated things feel very normal.
Oh, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. So for anyone who's watching, if you want to rewatch this this Crazy Talk episode, if you want to share it with your friends, you can do that by going to my Facebook page, facebook.com/Lee Thomas Speaks. That's LEETHOMAS. The word speaks. And thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for leaving your comments and your messages. And be sure to tune in next week, where we're going to be interviewing Allison Smith about mental health and parenting. Ooh. And yeah, so that's going to be live next Saturday at 12:30 Atlantic time. Again, it's going to be hosted on my Facebook page, facebook.com/Lee Thomas Speaks. Thanks all of you for tuning in, and we will see you next week. Bye, guys.